Okay, so now we're ready to read some philosophy, an actual old philosophical text. This text was written by Plato and it stars a character named Socrates. You'll see that it's in the form of a dialogue, and Socrates is one of the main people talking. He's the philosopher in the conversation. And you might ask yourself for a second if those names are familiar at all, Plato or Socrates. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. If they are, you could think for a moment what you associate with them. Um, so Socrates is considered the first major philosopher of what's called the Western tradition. So the Western tradition is the one that we stand in. It's the if you look back in history, the flow of thought um, in history behind our present moments. That's mostly the Western tradition. It's not to say at all that it's the only thing worthwhile in the world, but it's one that has had a big impact on who we are. And so I believe that it's worth studying that tradition to find out what's in it, to find out what's worthwhile in it, and find out what can be left behind. So there are plenty of other philosophers at the time of Socrates and before Socrates, but he's the one who really kind of launches a school of thought that has a big impact on this tradition and still does. He focused on community, morality, politics, ethics, had a very sharp focus on how we all get along with each other, and what are the ties that bind us, and how should we treat each other. He lived in a democracy at the time. He lived in ancient Athens, and Athens was a democracy, which was a very weird thing at that time, very unusual. Athens was doing something no other society, culture was doing around them. We take this as a very commonplace idea now, the idea of democracy. And we owe that partly through this idea of the tradition to thinkers like Socrates and the writings of Plato. But he wasn't active in government himself. He wasn't much of a Democrat in the sense of participating in politics in a very vigorous way, partly because he was worried that democracy didn't necessarily lead to the best results. He had a lot of problems with the kinds of decisions that got made by this democratic apparatus. And that was because people weren't very morally responsible in the first place. So it wasn't necessarily a problem with the mechanisms of democracy, of voting, of people having an equal say in things. It's that people weren't very well prepared to think about difficult moral issues and attack them collectively in the right way. And so what you got instead was a lot of people just voting their opinions about things, and usually their self-interested opinions about things. So he kind of took it on himself to try to make the citizens of Athens, the people who were engaged in democratic politics, to be more reflective and more critical of their own views. So he would go around to public places, he'd hang out in the marketplace and just talk to people about how they arrived at their opinions about moral questions, about how to live your life. And almost always in those conversations, the people he would talk to would start to get more and more confused about their own point of view, because Socrates would ask a lot of questions that would lead them to start to think that maybe how they're thinking about things doesn't quite make sense. So just some examples, they talked about some big topics. If you said you cared about justice, then you need to know what justice is. And usually talking to Socrates, you'd find out you maybe don't quite know what it is. Or if you cared about beauty, what is beauty? And again, Socrates' questions would lead you to think maybe you don't know what it is. Similarly, love and wisdom. So these are the way conversations with Socrates usually went. Just as a quick example of that, you're going to read an example of it, but just tell you quickly about this guy named Euthyphro. So it's the name of a guy in ancient Athens. And one of these dialogues that Plato wrote is called the Euthyphro because it's a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro. Socrates and Euthyphro run into each other at the courthouse. I'll tell you in a minute why Socrates was at the courthouse. But Socrates says, "Wow, Euthyphro, you're at the courthouse. What's going on? I hope nobody's charged you with a crime." And Euthyphro says, "No, no, no. I'm here because I've charged my own father with murder. I'm going to try to convict my father of murder." And Socrates is like, "Wow, that's kind of amazing because around here in Athens in those days, and I would say probably in our day too, people tend to look out for their family over what the law says might be required. So it's surprising to Socrates that Euthyphro would take his own father to trial. So Socrates ends up asking Euthyphro, what is your sense of justice? Like, how did you come to decide that this was the right thing to do? You clearly think it's the right thing to do. And so Euthyphro starts to explain himself, and then Socrates asks his troublesome questions, and pretty soon Euthyphro is very confused about his own thinking about why he's bringing his father to trial for murder. Somebody did die, by the way, so there was a death, but Socrates is just interested in Euthyphro's own understanding of justice. Like, what leads you, Euthyphro, to think that you this is the right thing to do? So at a certain point, Euthyphro just like throws up his hands and leaves the conversation because he is starting to doubt himself. And so it can be very frustrating for people to talk to Socrates. He frustrated people a lot, including a lot of people with power, to the point that some people in that ancient Athenian community charged Socrates with crimes. They brought him to court. They charged him with dishonoring the gods and with corrupting the youth. And they had their ways of making arguments about both, but they mostly were sick and tired of him, and they wanted him to stop. So the trial itself is in the form of a dialogue. It's called the Apology, which you can read. So if you get interested in Socrates, you can look at the trial and see how Plato wrote an account of it. But he's eventually convicted of the charge in the trial, and then he's sentenced to death. He is sentenced to death, and the death penalty in that day was to drink poison hemlock. And so Socrates goes to jail and he drinks the hemlock and he dies. So more you can learn about that as well. He's a very, very interesting figure. Okay, so Plato was his student, and Plato becomes the writer of the dialogue. So here's Plato, his teacher has died, and part of Plato's way of carrying Socrates forward, I suppose, paying tribute to him, is to write these dialogues as a record of his teacher and his teacher's methods and his teacher's thinking. So let's see. You're going to read a dialogue. So you're going to read a small, very small part of a big dialogue called The Republic. The Republic. And the title is not great for us in English. It's the project of the book is a conversation about what would the best city look like. If you were interested in justice and you wanted to design a city, what should that city look like? So that's what the conversation's about. He starts, this is part of the reason I thought about this text. It's maybe might be confusing why you're reading this passage from the Republic, but you'll notice, I think you'll see an association right at the beginning. It opens with a conversation with a guy named Cephalus. Cephalus was a wealthy old Athenian. He had made a lot of money selling arms, actually, to the army. So he was wealthy and comfortable, but he's getting old. And there's this neat line by Socrates, you'll see in the dialogue, I think it's in the part you read, that Socrates thinks you should always take opportunity to talk to older people because you can ask them what they've learned about life. Says they're a little out in front of us, and maybe they have things to teach us. Maybe they have wisdom. Maybe there's some wisdom to be gained. So Socrates starts talking to Cephalus. And Cephalus says, "Well, yeah, I have learned some things. One is I'm wealthy, and that has made me comfortable, and that's been a good thing. You get old, and the comfort of wealth can really be an advantage. Then he says, but when I think about death, I start to think about the afterlife, and I worry a little bit now that I'm older. I worry even more that maybe there's going to be some kind of judgment after I die, and it'll be important whether I was just, if I treated other people justly or not. But he says to Socrates, you know what? I think I've treated people justly, and so I'm feeling okay about the afterlife as well. So of course, this guy Socrates, if you have a sense of him by now, um, that just catches all his attention. Cephalus just told him that Cephalus, thinks he knows what it means to treat other people justly. So Socrates starts asking all his questions. And what you'll see in the dialogue is Cephalus proposes an initial definition of justice. I'll tell you what that is here. And that is that you pay your debts and you tell the truth. Pay your debts and tell the truth. That definition is going to get talked about a little bit. Socrates is going to challenge it pretty fast, meaning he doesn't like that definition too much. He's going to ask a few questions to see if Cephalus thinks the definition holds up. And somewhat surprisingly, I guess, Cephalus says, yeah, I guess you're right. That's not a very good definition. And then he splits. Cephalus just leaves. He doesn't want to find out more about what justice might be, even though he just told us that it's very important to him. So then that turns into a different definition of justice, one that I think will be familiar to us as well. I think it's one you see in the world quite a lot. And that definition is help your friends and harm your enemies. If you want to be a just person, it's a pretty simple formula: help your friends and harm your enemies. It's also known as the Greek ethic. It wasn't being made up on the spot in that dialogue. Everybody was used to thinking this way. So Socrates will start to question that way of thinking about justice as well. And it doesn't go for that very well for that definition either. So here's how I'm going to hope to make sense of this connection between the future you assignment we did early on and reading some philosophy now. Cephalus is at the end of his life, and he's looking back and he's saying, in terms of a marker of success, I, Cephalus, think that treating other people justly would be a good marker of that success. So there he had a way of thinking about what success is. But then when he talks to Socrates, he finds out that his definition of justice doesn't hold up very well. So that's a problem. That's a problem if you have a goal, a marker of success, but then you don't understand what that word means very well. So how can you meet the goal if you don't know what the word means? And so, is Cephalus wise? Cephalus is an older guy. He has a lot of experience. It tells us it's good to have some wealth, good to have treated other people justly. But if he doesn't know what justice really means, then what wisdom does he have to offer us? And so then that in turn shows us that it's important to figure those things out ahead of time. And so philosophy raises the proposition. One way of thinking about what philosophy texts do is they allow us to think through something like justice. Do you want to be a just person? Do you want to be a wise person? Do you want to be a good person? Do you want to be a courageous person? Those all sound good, but what do the words mean? And philosophy tries to take that question head on. What do those words mean? Let's figure it out. And then when we are striving to be a just or a good or a courageous person, we know what it means to be that. So take a look at the text. I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about. Good luck with it. And thanks for listening.